Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Kamila Stępień-Kutera. Welcome in our competition studio. Once again, I have an honor to host here Professor Karol Berger.
Once again, it's a pleasure.
Last time we talked about Chopin's genre and forms. We started with narrative ballads, and we talked about what does it mean that the piece of music is narrative, in fact. This time I would like to ask, starting with your book, Bach's Circle, Mozart's Arrow. I would like to start with the title, because in the title we have two figures, two shapes, the circle and arrow, and generally speaking, these are the symbols of way of shaping music in two eras, the era of Baroque, before modernity, and classicism, with the beginning of the modernity. But after Mozart, with his arrow, we have totally different era of Romanticism, the time when Chopin lived. How can we compare his understanding of time, of form, to those figures mentioned?
Yes, but perhaps we should start with something very fundamental, namely, I don't think that in history one cultural formation supplants another, that there's a kind of a relay, that first we have A and then we have B and A is forgotten. Very little in history is really forgotten. I think we rather have a kind of a layering of geological layers, so that Bach's way of shaping time is not forgotten, even when the moderns, Mozart, Beethoven, and so on, come up with something radically different. And especially with the Romantics, who revive so much of the Baroque music. And Chopin is certainly a key figure here. For Chopin, as you very well know, actually these two composers
yes.
Are the most important composers.
Yes.
Chopin was not very generous, by the way, when it comes to talking about professional competitors and colleagues and so on. He rarely was talking well about anyone, but of course these two he completely adored. So he was aware both of the music which does not want to go forward and music which goes forward, and he composed both kinds of music. Much of what he composed is, we started in our previous conversation, we talked about music where time arrow is central, and which cannot really be, this is the kind of music, ballads, the Polonaise Fantasie and so on, you cannot understand it without knowing, without following the order of events. When Chopin has the second theme in a piece like this, first in a very lyrical fashion, but then in the recapitulation it is suddenly transformed into something tremendously grandiose and pathetic and so on. Obviously it makes a difference whether something is presented for the first time or for the second time. So time arrow is very central. But much of what Chopin has composed is formally very uninteresting, deliberately uninteresting. He's not interested in shaping of the piece. He creates a very simple ABA structure, which is about as simple as can be. He's interested in something very different. He's interested in creating a static picture. Perhaps it's not necessarily that it is not static internally, but it is nevertheless a picture where it doesn't really matter. The order of events is not so central. So he's interested in both of these things in his music, precisely because things that were invented later are not supplanting things that were invented earlier. They coexist.
And what about his contemporaries? Because he was very different I think from such composers as Schumann, as Liszt. I don't know if Schubert can be named Chopin's contemporary, rather not exactly. But what about their attitude toward the time in music, toward the form?
I think it's actually quite similar. They are not as inventive formally when we talked about it earlier, but they are all interested in both ways of shaping time. They all created form that are arrow oriented, but they also all create these timeless or cyclical pictures. And I would, while I do think that Chopin is really quite unique, I wouldn't want to put down people like Schumann, for example, who is also wonderfully inventive after all in his piano fantasia in particular. He creates absolutely wonderful structures where he combines the timelessness with time arrow. You remember that when he starts the fantasia, we basically have a sense that the piece was already there before we hear the first notes. It is as if somebody turned on the radio. I don't know if you remember what radio is, but it is as if someone was turning on the radio, and suddenly the music which was already going on is being heard. So Schumann is also very, very inventive in the way he treats form and time.
When we are talking about such a big names, I started to think about your another essay, another article about the canon, and does it exist or does it not? Because when we are thinking about Chopin and Schumann also, the existence of canon seems indisputable. But at the same time, we can observe that for audiences, for people, the more and more things are now relative. So, do you think that there are some aesthetic values which are unrelative, really?
Yes, I do. I am not sure that I would be able to convince you, or even that I would have a proof. And maybe it is not entirely important. What really matters is that there are composers for whom Schumann or Chopin is important today. What really matters is that there are pianists who play them. This is really how canon is established. You know, whether a professor of musicology says that something is canonic or not is without any importance. Critics and writers and so play secondary role. It is the artists who really decide about what is canonic and what is not. It so happens that Schumann is certainly of great interest to a number of interesting composers today. I'm not sure about Chopin, to tell you the truth. Maybe yes, maybe I simply don't know. But I know certainly that someone like Jörg Widmann in Germany is very interested in Schumann. As for the presence of Chopin in pianistic repertoire, I probably don't need to comment in this particular context. It seems that some people are still playing him, so he's still alive.
Some of them.
Yes.
Well, I think that the same issue is something measurable or not. Is it relative or not? We can talk about it regarding the performances, but in this case, it is not. We can't be so sure that we can choose one ideal performance. Although we are trying during the competition.
I would be very much against the idea of an ideal performance. It seems to me that the very essence of how Western music works, namely that there is a score and there is a performance, invites variety and plurality. It would be a pity if we had only one ideal, because once this ideal is changed, we should really move on to something else, right? And a composer is alive precisely because new ways of performing him will be invented with every new generation, perhaps new interest in old instruments, or new composers will make old composers look new. There are a variety of ways in which these things move on. So no uniformity in performance, please.
This is very good closing of our conversation. Now we can really wait for the effects of Chopin competition and not to be afraid that the jury opinions is something ultimate and it means that everything is closed. My guest was Professor Karol Berger. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.